Breakfast today is a preference. Light or heavy, sweet or savory, skipped, scrolled through, or scarfed at a desk. We frame it around taste, convenience, mood, rarely around what it truly costs the rest of the day. On the American frontier, breakfast was no such indulgence. It was a calculated necessity, the one reliable opportunity to load the body for the long, unforgiving hours ahead. Settlers rose before dawn, fueled by whatever the land and wagon could provide, then stepped into labour, dictated by sunrise, weather, livestock, and miles of unbroken work. Pauses were scarce, reliable food even scarcer. In many cases, wagon trains rolling by 4 a.m. Homestead chores, from milking to wood chopping. Fields stretching endlessly, the next substantial meal waited until evening, if at all. Historical diaries, journals, and frontier manuals make it clear breakfast shouldered the full weight of survival. It wasn't a quick jolt of sugar or caffeine. It was built for endurance, slow-digesting cornmeal mush or porridge, often left simmering overnight over embers, a trick borrowed from native practices. Ash cakes or johnny cakes baked in hot coals, slabs of salt, pork, or bacon, fried crisp for fat and protein, perhaps eggs from a precious hen or cold leftovers folded in. Coffee or chicory-laced substitutes washed it down, but the real power came from high-satiety staples, cornmeal for steady carbohydrates, preserved pork for lasting energy, minimal sweetness beyond occasional molasses. Repetition wasn't monotony, it was dependability in a world where variety could mean spoilage or scarcity. Across decades and regions, from colonial Virginia outposts to Oregon trail wagons to Midwest homesteads, people sustained grueling physical output without the mid-morning fog, the desperate grazing, or the crashes that plague so many of us now. No vending machines, no energy bars, no snack culture, just one carefully constructed meal to carry the day. That leaves a quiet, persistent question. Not just what frontier Americans ate first thing in the morning, but why their breakfast was engineered so deliberately to sustain unbroken effort, and why, despite all our options, so many modern mornings quietly undermine the hours that follow. Frontier mornings began early because daylight determined how much work could be done safely. Fires had to be tended, water hauled, animals fed, tools prepared. These tasks could not wait, and once heavier work began ploughing, clearing timber, herding, travel, it often continued for hours without interruption. That rhythm shaped breakfast in ways that are easy to miss from a modern perspective. Work was organized into long, continuous blocks, not short segments separated by frequent meals. Weather, distance, and season dictated the pace. During planting, harvest, or travel, stopping later in the morning for another substantial meal was often impractical or impossible. Hunger was not something to be addressed reactively. It had to be prevented in advance. As a result, breakfast carried unusual weight. In many frontier and rural settings, the structured meals of the day were limited. Breakfast came early. Dinner, the largest meal, was taken at midday if circumstances allowed. Supper, when it happened at all, was typically light. There was no assumption of a separate midday refueling between breakfast and dinner, and no reliable lunch to fall back on. This compressed eating pattern pushed energy planning toward the morning. Frontier breakfasts, therefore, emphasized durability over stimulation. Meals relied on locally available staples: cornmeal, mush, cornbread, biscuits, salt pork, preserved meats, and occasionally eggs. Foods chosen not for variety, but for their ability to sustain effort over time. Sweetness was limited, not by ideology, but by cost, transport, difficulty, and scarcity. Grains and fats were more dependable than sugar in remote conditions. The work that followed demanded it. Clearing land, repairing structures, hauling firewood, tending animals, and travelling long distances required steady output, not brief bursts of energy. Fatigue did not announce itself immediately. It accumulated, slowing movement, narrowing attention, and increasing risk as the day wore on. Because the consequences of collapse were delayed but serious, households treated the first meal as a form of risk management. Breakfast was expected to front-load enough energy to reduce the chance of midday failure when stopping might no longer be possible. Scarcity, unpredictable supply, and environmental uncertainty reinforced this logic. Repetition was not a limitation, it was a safeguard. Familiar, filling morning meals functioned as quiet infrastructure, absorbing uncertainty before the day's demands fully revealed themselves. Seen this way, frontier breakfast was not a cultural habit. It was a practical response to constraint. Early settlers did not arrive on the American frontier with a fully formed frontier breakfast. They brought habits with them, customs shaped in England and Europe, where daily rhythms were different and constraints less severe. In those older settings, breakfast consisted of tea, bread, and butter in various forms, with coffee, chocolate, and marmalade served in wealthier households. In England's upper classes, breakfast was typically served between 9 and 11:30 a.m., a leisurely affair that assumed proximity to resources. It was not expected to carry the body through a full day of physical strain. Fields were closer. Markets were nearer. Meals were more predictable. If the morning meal was light, it could be corrected later. That assumption did not hold on the frontier. As settlers moved farther from towns and deeper into agricultural and frontier labour, inherited breakfast patterns began to fail quietly. In 1728, the Boston Newsletter reported that middle-class families ate breakfast consisting merely of bread and milk, a meal pattern imported directly from England. But frontier conditions proved different. Early accounts describe settlers subsisting on little else than salt, pork, cornbread made with coarse meal, and wild game, with most first-hand accounts describing the food unfavourably. A light morning meal that worked in England did not sustain hours of land clearing, long-distance travel, or seasonal labour under exposure. Hunger returned too early. Fatigue arrived before the day's work was finished. The response was not ideological, it was practical. Breakfast began to shift, not because settlers rejected their traditions, but because the environment forced adaptation. Frontier settlers typically began their day at dawn, as rising early was essential for maximizing the limited daylight hours available for work. This alone represented a dramatic shift from England's late morning breakfast customs. In frontier outposts and on farms, families drank cider or beer and gulped down a bowl of porridge that had been cooking slowly all night over the embers. Meals grew heavier. Energy-dense staples replaced lighter fare. What had once been a gentle opening to the day became a critical preparation for it. This transition was uneven and gradual. Wealthier households could delay breakfast or supplement later meals more easily. Poorer households and backcountry settlers relied heavily on clabber, a yogurt-like food made with soured milk, and mush made from soured milk or boiled grains as standard breakfast fare. Over time, frontier conditions flattened those differences. Regardless of class, breakfast increasingly had to do real work. The frontier did not create a new breakfast culture out of preference. It stripped away habits that no longer functioned. Settlers had to depend on corn, wild buffalo, black bears, and preserved meats, with eggs, milk, and butter only sometimes available, as some kept cattle and chicken. What remained was not refined or varied, but it was effective. In this way, frontier breakfast was not an innovation. It was a correction, a quiet recalibration of the morning meal to match the demands of a longer, harder, less forgiving day, one that began at dawn rather than mid-morning, and required sustained energy rather than social refinement. What settlers chose to eat next was shaped by that correction and by little else. Once inherited, habits were stripped away. Frontier breakfast settled into a form shaped almost entirely by constraint. It was not designed as a menu. It was assembled as a system. Across regions, climates, and levels of wealth, from the rolling Midwest prairies to Appalachian hollows, New England outposts, and Oregon trail wagons, the morning meal converged on a narrow set of characteristics. Foods were chosen less for preference than for reliability. They had to be easy to produce locally, simple to store, and predictable in their effects. Variety was not avoided intentionally. It was simply unnecessary. The backbone of frontier breakfast was grain. Cornmeal in particular became central not because it was celebrated, but because it could be grown in difficult conditions, stored without spoilage, and transformed into filling meals with minimal effort. Mush, often left simmering overnight, over embers for a thick, hearty porridge, sometimes with a splash of milk, if a cow was handy, appeared daily on many tables. Ash cakes, simple cornmeal dough, baked directly in hot coals, or johnny cakes, hoe cakes, batter freed on a griddle, or even the flat side of a hoe over the fire, provided quick, dense energy. Corn dodgers, oval fried cornmeal cakes, travelled well on trails. These preparations favoured density over delicacy, turning coarse meal into something that could sustain hours of chopping wood, milking, or wagon driving. Fat played a quiet but essential role. Salt, pork, or bacon preserved slabs soaked to draw out excess salt. Then fried crisp in their own grease was added sparingly but consistently, as in a Nebraska schoolteacher's 1,857 breakfast of cornbread and salt pork, or an Oregon Trail camp's standard bacon, alongside mush or johnny cakes. Rendered lard or saved drippings from the night before slowed digestion and extended energy release, turning otherwise simple grains into meals capable of carrying through long, uninterrupted work. When eggs were available from a precious hen or bartered along the trail, they were valued not as a luxury, but as a practical supplement, easy to fry, scramble, or boil, dense and familiar, often paired with fried pork or stirred into mush for extra substance. Leftovers were not treated as a lesser option. They were an asset. Cold cornbread from supper, reheated beans with bits of pork, or remnants like fried mush slices acidified overnight and crisped in the pan, often appeared at breakfast, not out of frugality alone, but because they eliminated uncertainty. Food that had already proven reliable was reused deliberately. What is equally important is what frontier breakfasts generally lacked. Sweetness was limited. Refined sugar was costly, difficult to transport, and quick to exhaust. Any hint came from occasional molasses, drizzled sparingly on mush or johnny cakes. Flavouring existed salt, perhaps wild herbs, but stimulation was not the goal. Morning meals were not built to excite appetite or elevate mood. They were built to remove hunger as a variable. Beverages followed the same logic. Water quality was inconsistent, so morning drinks often came from boiled coffee, roasted and ground fresh over the fire, a near-universal trail staple, chicory substitutes, or cider, safer, familiar, and sipped for dependability rather than a jolt. The result was a breakfast that could appear austere by modern standards, repetitive, plain, unremarkable. But that appearance is misleading. Frontier breakfast was doing something subtle and difficult. It was converting limited ingredients into sustained output. It was reducing the likelihood of hunger reasserting itself at the wrong moment. It was allowing work to proceed without interruption in environments that punish delay. Seen through that lens, frontier breakfast was not a cultural artifact. It was a functional solution, assembled piece by piece, tested daily, and retained only because it worked. From the outside, frontier breakfast can appear monotonous. The same grains, the same preparations, the same flavours, day after day. By modern standards, it looks constrained, even joyless. That interpretation misses the function repetition served. On the frontier, repetition was not a failure of imagination, it was a form of engineering. When work demanded long, uninterrupted effort, predictability mattered more than novelty. A familiar breakfast produced familiar results. Digestion followed a known timeline. Hunger arrived, if it arrived at all, when it could be managed rather than when it disrupted labor. There were fewer surprises, fewer variables to track. This mattered because uncertainty already dominated every other part of the day. Weather shifted without warning. Tools broke, animals wandered, crops failed. Adding dietary unpredictability on top of those risks served no purpose. Repetition reduced cognitive load as well. The morning did not require decisions about what to eat, how much, or whether it would be enough. Those questions had already been answered by habit. The system removed choice in order to preserve capacity for work. In this sense, boredom was not a cost. It was a stabilizer. Modern eating culture often treats variety as a marker of quality. On the frontier, variety increased exposure. New foods could digest differently. They could trigger hunger sooner or sap energy unexpectedly. Familiar meals were trusted precisely because they had been tested under pressure. The same logic applied across seasons. During periods of intense labor planting, harvest, travel, and breakfast narrowed further. Anything unnecessary was removed. What remained was what reliably worked. This repetition also made planning easier. Staples could be stored, preserved, and rationed with confidence. Families knew how long supplies would last and what output they could expect in return. That predictability reduced risk not just for individuals, but for households as a whole. Seen this way, frontier breakfast was not repetitive because options were limited. It was repetitive because reliability was valued above all else. The meal was not meant to be interesting. It was meant to disappear into the background, allowing attention and energy to be spent elsewhere. Repetition turned breakfast into infrastructure, quiet, unremarkable, and essential. It was a system designed to function without drawing notice, precisely because failure would arrive later, when correction was hardest. This design choice helps explain why frontier breakfast endured for generations. It did not need to be defended or celebrated. It simply worked, and that was enough. When frontier breakfast is examined through surviving records, it appears less as a cultural preference and more as a consistent pattern reinforced over time. Household accounts, farming journals, and practical manuals from frontier regions repeatedly describe days organized around long work intervals rather than frequent meals. Morning eating appears early and substantial, often completed by 4 a.m. on wagon trains, so the group could depart at first light, with staples like cornmeal mush, johnny cakes, beans, pork, and coffee providing the fuel. Midday meals appear when circumstances allow, a brief nooning rest with leftovers or cold fare, while evening meals are lighter, sometimes absent after a full day's haul. What is striking is not what is emphasized, but what is missing. There is little evidence of routine mid-morning refueling or planned interruptions for hunger. This absence is telling. If frontier breakfasts had routinely failed to sustain labor, the record would reflect it. Complaints about hunger, work stoppages, or the need for additional food would appear regularly instead. Diaries and journals describe relentless progress, rising before dawn, eating quickly, then pushing through hours of travel, chopping, ploughing, or herding with minimal breaks. As one Oregon Trail account notes, the routine was governed by the sun breakfast wrapped up early to keep the wagons rolling 15-20 miles a day, with provisions like bacon, cornmeal, and beans chosen precisely because they filled the belly for sustained effort without constant grazing. Patterns repeat across regions. Where labor was heavier and distances longer, as on the Oregon Trail, or in isolated homesteads, morning meals tended to be larger relative to later ones dense, portable energy front-loaded when correction was uncertain. Where work was lighter or schedules more flexible, for example, established farms, breakfast could be reduced, but the underlying logic remained stable. Front-load energy when the day's demands were unforgiving. Modern observations help clarify why this mattered, without redefining it. Meals that combine dense staples with fat digest more slowly and delay the return of hunger effects. Frontier households learned empirically through repetition and necessity, as seen in the repeated use of cornmeal mush simmered overnight or salt pork fried crisp to extend output. The evidence does not suggest optimization in the modern sense. There was no calculation of nutrients, no pursuit of peak performance. What it shows instead is selection. Meals that failed were abandoned. Meals that sustained work were repeated over time. Ineffective patterns disappeared from daily practice, leaving behind hardy, reliable ones documented in journals and manuals. This process left behind a breakfast system that looks unremarkable on paper, but performed reliably in practice. It was not preserved because it was ideal, but because it was sufficient under pressure. What survives in the record is not a celebration of frontier breakfast, but its quiet persistence. That persistence is itself the evidence. A system does not endure across decades of hardship unless it solves a real problem. By the time frontier life was reshaped by industrial schedules and urban proximity, breakfast had already done its work. Its logic had been absorbed, normalized, and eventually forgotten, not because it failed, but because the conditions that required it began to fade. Understanding that distinction matters. Without it, the shift that followed can appear cultural or accidental. In reality, it was neither. The frontier breakfast system did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the conditions that required it slowly dissolved. As work became centralized, indoor, and scheduled, the risk profile of the day changed. Distance shortened. Meals became predictable. Food grew closer and cheaper. The need to front-load stability into the morning weakened, and breakfast followed that shift. It became lighter, sweeter, faster. Designed less to carry the body through uncertainty and more to activate it briefly. Over time, breakfast stopped being built for duration and began to serve convenience instead. Energy no longer needed to last. It only needed to start. When it faded, it could be corrected later with another meal, a stimulant, or a pause in work. The system fragmented, but the cost of fragmentation felt small enough to ignore. What was lost in that transition was not a menu, but a way of thinking. Frontier breakfast treated the morning as a point of commitment. Once the day began, correction was difficult. That reality forced meals to be sized, composed, and repeated in ways that absorbed risk early. The goal was not comfort or stimulation, but reliability. Breakfast had a job, and everything about it reflected that responsibility. Modern breakfast operates under different assumptions. The day is flexible. Energy dips are acceptable. Hunger is expected and managed reactively. In that context, the old system looks unnecessary, even excessive. But the contrast reveals something important. Systems built for long-term resilience do not optimize for pleasure or efficiency. They optimize for stability under uncertainty. They remove variables rather than adding options. They disappear into routine because their success lies in what does not happen: missed work, stalled effort, preventable failure. Frontier Americans did not preserve their breakfast system because they admired it. They kept it because it worked. The question now is not whether we should eat the same foods or live under the same constraints. It is whether other parts of modern life still depend on systems that quietly carried risk for us, and whether we recognize them only after they are gone.